Under the soft hum of the plane's engines and the low murmur of conversation from passengers around her, Marina Kowalski leaned her forehead against the oval window, watching the jagged coastline below slowly sharpen into the green-gray sprawl of her homeland. She hadn't expected to feel much after all. The return was planned, calculated, logical. There had been no romantic longing, no burning homesickness. Only a quiet acknowledgement that her contract work in Panama was done, and that it was time to return to what was left of her American life. But as the wheels screeched against the tarmac and the aircraft coasted to a halt, something caught in her chest. She was coming home not in a metaphorical sense, not with emotional overtones, but in the most practical way possible. Her name was still on the property deed. The taxes were paid. The land was hers. That made it home, whether she liked it or not. 2 days later, her boots crunched against the familiar gravel of a narrow service road that curved through a sparse stretch of pines toward the river. Her breath caught not out of sentimentality, but from the sharp, metallic edge of winter still lingering in the air. The property, a long rectangular lot nestled against a slow-moving river bend, had been in her family for decades. Her uncle had lived there for nearly 30 years before passing, and Marina had inherited it almost absently, the result of a will left with little ceremony and even less explanation. She had kept it, paid the property taxes, and hired a maintenance company to check on it once a season. During her time overseas supervising dam reinforcements and infrastructure audits, she had come to appreciate the clarity of physical space. Land didn't lie, didn't manipulate. It was either there or not. So when she approached the final turn of the gravel road, stepping out from behind the skeletal branches of the trees and into full view of the lot, she froze. There was nothing there. Not in the dramatic, post-disaster sense of nothing. No scorched ruins, no shattered glass or collapsed beams. Simply absence. Flat, seeded earth. Neatly rolled turf. A garbage receptacle bolted to a cement pad near what used to be the edge of the property line. A small wooden sign with sanitized serif font read, Community Access Greenbelt Environmental Protection Zone. No welcome sign, no barrier, no acknowledgement of what had once stood there: the pier, the cabin, the shed, the old rain barrel that used to sit crookedly near the river bend. All gone, erased like they had never been, like she had never been. Marina didn't move for a long moment. Her hand was still clutching the key, the one that had once opened the rusted padlock on the storage unit behind the cabin. She had flown with it in her coat pocket like a token of continuity, the physical connection between two versions of her life. It felt absurd in her palm now. She tucked it back into her jacket, pulled out her phone, and took 2 photographs. Not out of shock or grief, not yet, just as evidence. This was not a situation for reaction. It was one for documentation. Back in the truck she had rented for the drive, she sat silently for several minutes before opening her laptop and connecting to the mobile hotspot. Within 5 minutes, she had retrieved the most recent property tax statement paid in full 3 months ago and confirmed her ownership status with the county database. Her name was still there, Marina Kowalski. No liens, no easements, no disputes on file. Her parcel had not been sold, transferred, or reassigned. So how the hell was it now a community greenbelt? By the time she arrived at the county recorder's office the next morning, Marina had assembled a binder of her legal documents, purchase history, tax payments, archived maintenance receipts, and the original will. The clerk at the counter, a thin woman with a disinterested smile, took the paperwork with a perfunctory nod and began typing into her terminal. Marina watched the screen rotate between windows. The clerk frowned, clicked something twice, then sighed. It says here the property was transitioned into a provisional conservation easement as part of a neighborhood-wide shoreline stabilization effort, she said in the voice of someone who had delivered this kind of news before, someone well-practiced in red tape deflection. Marina blinked. That's not possible. I never signed anything. I never approved any such thing. I haven't authorized any changes. The clerk shrugged. All I can tell you is what's in the system, and who submitted the request to initiate this transition. Another shrug. Looks like it came from a local community oversight board. There's a notation here, non-response after 3 certified attempts to notify property owner. I was out of the country. My mail was redirected to a law firm, and they received nothing of the sort. The woman looked at her, mildly irritated, then leaned over to examine something on the screen. The last listed address was the river property itself. That's where the notices went. Of course. Marina's mouth tightened. She had filed a change of correspondence over a year ago, but it wouldn't matter. If the board wanted plausible deniability, all they had to do was send letters to an uninhabited property, wait for silence, and check a box. She left the recorder's office with a headache blooming behind her right eye and a folder of thinly veiled evasions. By noon, she was seated across from a private land use attorney in a glass-walled conference room in a mid-rise downtown. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Torres, skimmed the papers with a professional swiftness that spoke of long hours in county land records. Easement or no easement, they can't just raise a structure without your consent, she said. Not without a condemnation order or an environmental emergency declaration. Did they issue either? No. Then we'll begin with a request for full disclosure of demolition permits and the environmental justification for the reassignment. If they can't produce that, we move straight to injunction. Marina nodded once, crisply. She appreciated the absence of sympathy in Torres's voice. This wasn't about empathy. It was about leverage. But still, as she left the office, her hands curled around the strap of her bag, and a single thought pushed through the practicality of her resolve. But someone decided to take it from me while I was gone. And they were so confident I wouldn't come back, they didn't even try to cover their tracks. The real question now was why. Why that property, why now, and why so aggressively? There had been no community interest in the parcel for years. It flooded in the spring, it had no through access, and it sat far enough from major roads that it wasn't exactly prime real estate. The only distinguishing feature was the river and the fact that it had deep bed access, which meant potential for discreet water entry. That at least gave her a working theory. The property wasn't valuable because it was charming, it was valuable because it was useful to someone else. And if someone had gone through all the trouble of wiping it clean while she was out of the country navigating legal gray zones, issuing silent orders, misdirecting notices, then it wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated move, one that assumed she wouldn't return, or at least wouldn't fight. That assumption, Marina thought coldly, was about to cost them. 3 days later, the letter arrived not through the post, but slipped beneath the windshield wiper of Marina's truck while it was parked in front of the small grocery store on Elm. The envelope was unmarked, thick and heavy, the kind of paper stock usually reserved for legal correspondence or wedding invitations. She opened it standing beside the vehicle, a single brow lifting as she read the contents in the winter sunlight. The letterhead was from a local organization she'd never heard of before, innocuously titled the Riverbend Environmental Restoration Cooperative, PIP, and the language inside was polished to the point of sterility. It congratulated her on the successful integration of her parcel into the Riverbend Greenbelt Initiative and thanked her for her unspoken contribution to preserving the ecological harmony of the district. There was no mention of compensation, no invitation for feedback, no explanation of process. At the bottom of the page, in a clean digital font, was a signature D. Hayden, Executive Liaison. There was no title, no contact information, no follow-up instructions, just an assumption of finality, as if the matter were settled. Marina folded the letter once and placed it carefully in the glove compartment. She didn't need to react emotionally to it, not yet. What struck her more than the content was the method of delivery. Someone had known where she was parked. Someone had approached her vehicle and taken the time to place the letter there, not in her mailbox or handed off through an office, but on her windshield, like a warning or a calling card. That wasn't efficiency, that was a message. She didn't know who Hayden was, but she already disliked the implication that whatever was happening to her land was now dressed up in the language of ecological altruism. That evening she began mapping the sequence of events, not as a detective chasing clues, but as an engineer reconstructing a collapse. She pulled up public records on the Riverbend Greenbelt Initiative and found a threadbare trail of local press releases, vague promotional materials, and a short video of a community meeting in which a few older residents nodded passively while someone from the restoration group spoke about resilient shoreline management and inclusivity in transitional property zones. Her parcel had not been mentioned by name, but a map shown briefly on a projector clearly included her former lot shaded in green. She took a screenshot and added it to her file. Her next move was to identify who exactly had the authority to declare her land part of this initiative. That led her to a secondary public document, the county's Shoreline Overlay Adjustment Proposal, quietly introduced during a summer board meeting when most people were on vacation and passed without much resistance. The measure allowed community entities to propose provisional reclassification of vulnerable shoreline properties for environmental purposes if the owner could not be contacted within a 90-day window. It was a legal workaround a soft seizure masked as environmental stewardship. By the next morning, Marina had gathered enough information to request a formal explanation. She visited the temporary office listed as the headquarters for the Riverbend Cooperative, a refurbished storefront in an old industrial strip just off the highway. The building was too polished, the interior too curated potted plants, minimalist furniture, and calming landscape photography on the walls. Everything screamed of consultant money and soft branding, not grassroots effort. A young man at the front desk greeted her with a rehearsed smile, and after a brief wait, she was ushered into a glass-walled office where a man in his late 50s sat behind a desk, looking every bit the picture of professional detachment. He rose, extended a hand, and introduced himself as Dale Hayden. His handshake was dry and precise, his smile exact. Marina sat, placed her folder on the desk, and said, "I'm the owner of parcel 481027, formerly Riverfront Residential. You're listed as the signatory for the cooperative that has apparently integrated that land into your initiative. I want to know how and why that happened." Hayden did not blink. "Ms. Kowalski, thank you for coming in. We've been expecting some inquiries as the final stage of the transition concludes. Your parcel was identified last year as a high-risk site for bank erosion and sediment displacement, which triggered a provisional review under the shoreline overlay." Marina stared at him. "Identified by whom?" "A committee of environmental engineers and urban planners contracted through the cooperative. Names? I'd have to check which team led that section. It rotates." "And did any of these engineers contact me, inspect the property with my knowledge, or issue an official notice of their findings?" "We sent out notification letters to all property owners in the affected region." "To a parcel that was unoccupied for over a year? With no forwarding address used, despite one being on file with the tax office?" Hayden's voice remained calm, measured. "Our responsibility was to notify the address listed in the county's GI system. If that data was inaccurate, I'm afraid it falls outside of our operational purview." "Your purview includes demolishing a standing structure without a court order or consent from the owner." "The structure was non-compliant with updated shoreline setback regulations. It was within the reclassified buffer zone. Temporary structures on such land can be removed under Section 14 billion of the Restoration Guidelines." Marina felt a heat building in her chest. It was not a temporary structure. It was a permitted, permanent cabin built in 1982 with documented repairs as recently as 2019. It had utility hookups, a postal address, and a registered lot number. Hayden exhaled, a patient sound. "Ms. Kowalski, I understand this is frustrating. These transitions often feel abrupt, but we're working toward a broader good. The riverfront is being returned to the public. It's not an act of hostility. You didn't return anything. You took it." He met her gaze without flinching. There are compensation options. If you're willing to accept reclassification, we can offer a financial package above market. In fact, she narrowed her eyes. And if I'm not, he folded his hands. Then I suppose we'll have to let the administrative process run its course. Marina stood, gathering her folder. Let it run. Just don't assume I'm standing still. As she left the office, she felt no surge of anger, no adrenaline. Only a precise alignment of facts in her mind. This wasn't about an ecological mission. It wasn't about protecting the river or managing sediment. This was about access and location, about removing one silent piece on the board so another could be moved in its place. Someone had needed her land out of the way, and they had cloaked the maneuver in the language of public good. They had counted on her being gone, counted on her ignoring a small loss in the scheme of a long career abroad, counted on her folding quietly into the folds of bureaucratic finality. But what they hadn't counted on was the fact that she had spent decades untangling legal frameworks more complex than this, overseeing projects in unstable regions where paperwork and chain of command could mean the difference between safety and sabotage. She wasn't angry, not yet, but she was engaged. That, she knew, would become a problem for them. She returned to her temporary rental house and spent the rest of the day organizing the layers of what she had uncovered. The reclassification proposal, the failure of proper notification, the lack of permits for demolition, the offer of compensation tied to silence, the presence of a private cooperative acting with municipal authority. It was a carefully orchestrated maneuver, but it wasn't flawless. Somewhere in that structure, there would be a misstep, a false assumption, a forged connection, a gap in process that couldn't be papered over with branded language and smiling front office assistants. Late that night, she stood outside in the freezing air, looking out across a landscape she could no longer see, but could still map in her mind. She remembered every angle of that lot, every slope of the ground, the sound of water slapping the underside of the old pier, the hum of mosquitoes in the summer, the way her uncle's chair used to creak on the porch boards when he leaned too far back. She didn't want the land out of sentimentality, she wanted it because it was hers. Because it had been taken not by force but by arrogance. And that, she decided, would be their mistake. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came not through a formal channel or an unexpected notice, but through the silence of her own inquiries. Marina had spent years working in regulatory systems. She knew how long bureaucracy took, but she also knew what purposeful delay looked like. After her meeting with Hayden, she submitted an official request for copies of all permits, correspondence, and documentation related to the demolition of her property. The deadline for a response under state open records law came and went without acknowledgement. She filed a follow-up, and a week later received an automated email stating that the Riverbend Cooperative was experiencing delays in documentation delivery due to administrative restructuring. There was no phone number listed. The original office she had visited now had limited hours posted on the door, and the receptionist she had spoken with no longer answered emails. Marina didn't interpret this as chaos or inefficiency, she recognized it instantly as control. Someone was slowing the system to keep her at arm's length while their process continued behind closed doors. That same week, she returned to the site, wanting to walk the perimeter of what had been hers, if only to confirm the extent of the intrusion. The land had changed in her absence. The clearing was too clean, too uniform, as if shaped to be photographed. A new gravel path had been cut along the western edge of the lot, leading down toward the water. She followed it until she reached a shallow embankment where the river had been visibly altered. Riprap stones had been installed along the shore, and the slope had been regraded. A single sign stood near the water's edge, emblazoned with a sleek corporate-style logo that read Future Site, Riverbend Observation Point. There was a QR code at the bottom of the sign, and when she scanned it, her phone opened a promotional site boasting accessible natural spaces, restored public habitats, and a model for environmentally integrated public-private partnerships. The listed sponsors included two well-known development firms, a regional consulting group, and the Riverbend Cooperative. She stood at the edge of the altered shore, holding the phone in one hand and fighting the sense of violation that had begun to spread in her chest. This wasn't just about land reclamation. This was an appropriation rebranding a private parcel as a symbol of progressive development, while quietly erasing the fact that it had been someone's property, someone's home, her home, and the observation point, that was not a community amenity. That was a commercial talking point, a detail for grant applications and project showcases. By the end of that day, she had a new plan. Her first step was to hire a land surveyor not just to remap the borders of her parcel, but to compare its current topography to older records. The man she hired, a methodical and quiet professional named Ortiz, took his time and showed no surprise when she told him the lot had been demolished. He had seen worse. Over the course of 2 days, he recorded elevation shifts, soil compaction levels, and changes to the slope and vegetation. When he presented his findings, he didn't sugarcoat them. The riverbank had been engineered. The grading and riprap weren't part of erosion control, they were preparation for load bearing. This wasn't about stabilizing the shoreline, he said. It's about supporting something heavy that hasn't been built yet. She asked him to include that in his report and sent copies to her attorney. Torres responded within the hour, her tone sharper than before. The addition of private funding partners and future development plans changed the nature of the case. Now, instead of arguing a regulatory overreach, they could begin to make a case for illegal takings, the transformation of private land into a quasi-public amenity with private benefit, done without compensation or due process. It was a more aggressive angle, one that required absolute precision, but it also opened a door to discovery. They filed for an emergency injunction to halt all further development on the site, and while they waited for a court date, Marina began digging deeper. Her focus turned to the organizational structure of the Riverbend Cooperative. Despite the name, it was not a government entity. It was a nonprofit with a complex funding structure, multiple advisory boards, and a rotating executive leadership model. Its financial filings, while public, were intentionally dense, filled with overlapping project names and ambiguous line items. But one detail stood out: the cooperative's largest single donation for the fiscal year had come from a shell entity registered to a P.O. box in Denver, an LLC with no online footprint and no registered phone number. That wasn't just suspicious. That was calculated. Torres brought in a forensic accountant to begin tracing the origin of the LLC's funds, and within days they found something stranger. The shell company had been used before, not in Riverbend, but in a coastal redevelopment project 2 states away, where a nearly identical Greenbelt initiative had been rolled out, followed by the sale of peripheral land parcels to a corporate hospitality group. The sequence was familiar: environmental justification, cooperative buy-in, ambiguous public purpose, and eventual privatization. It was a playbook, and Marina's land had been one of the pieces they assumed no one would fight for. The same afternoon that Torres prepared the first draft of their legal complaint, Marina received a knock at the door of her rental house. A man in a city jacket stood on the porch, clipboard in hand, politely informing her that her current residence had been flagged for a zoning review due to possible noncompliance with short-term rental regulations. When she asked who filed the complaint, he shrugged and said it was anonymous. She nodded, thanked him, and closed the door without comment. That night, a car she didn't recognize idled outside her driveway for nearly an hour. The driver didn't get out. The car eventually left when the porch light turned on and stayed on. Marina noted the license plate. The next day, someone filed a complaint with the county claiming she had built an unauthorized fence around her demolished property. There was no fence. There was barely even a perimeter anymore. She logged each event, each false report, each subtle threat. She said nothing publicly and made no calls to local media. That wasn't the kind of war she was fighting. Instead, she began building a timeline. She created a folder titled Pressure Points and filled it with evidence, Photographs, timestamps, copies of complaints, documentation of site alterations, and every point of contact she had with the cooperative. She cross-referenced every name mentioned in meetings, board memberships, or emails with public business records. It was slow, meticulous work, and it revealed something more troubling than she expected: overlap. The names that appeared on the cooperative's advisory board also appeared in regional development proposals, lobbying records, and filings for corporate entities that had submitted infrastructure plans for nearby waterfront construction. What had seemed like a passive land seizure cloaked in environmental policy was, in reality, the quiet groundwork for a development pipeline. Her property had simply been in the way. Torres cautioned her to stay quiet for the time being. The injunction was moving forward, and the complaint had teeth. But Marina knew this stage. It was the part where they tried to exhaust her, chip at her endurance, test how far she was willing to push. The calls, the letters, the inspections, it was pressure by 1,000 cuts. But she wasn't trying to win a headline. She was trying to force a reckoning. What they didn't understand yet was that she wasn't navigating this like someone who had lost a home. She was approaching it like a structural failure, one where the load-bearing elements had been compromised. And it was only a matter of time before the entire framework collapsed under its own hidden weight. One evening she returned from a meeting with Torres to find a man standing near the edge of the lot. He wasn't wearing a uniform or a badge, just dark clothes and a lanyard with an unrecognizable logo. When she approached, he claimed to be from the cooperative and said he was surveying the land for a habitat integration study. She asked to see his identification. He refused. She took his photo. He walked away. By the time she checked the cooperative's website, all references to future development on her lot had been removed. She didn't need confirmation to know what that meant. They were adjusting the story in real time, trying to erase their steps, to reframe what had been clearly planned as something more ambiguous, less deliberate. But she had already documented too much. The record was set, and the longer they stalled, the more contradictions they created. As winter began to pull tighter around the town, Marina moved into a small guest house closer to the county courthouse. She installed security cameras around the rental and stopped responding to casual inquiries. The time for surface-level civility had passed. Now it was a matter of structural integrity, of building a case solid enough to hold against pressure, against manipulation, and against the quiet, smiling arrogance of people who believed they could take something without consequence, simply because they had the tools to disguise it. The escalation was not in noise or confrontation. It was in silence, in method, in the unwavering clarity of someone who knew how systems worked and how they failed. It was just after dawn when Marina received the email that subtly shifted everything. The sender was someone from a state regulatory office, one of the less visible arms of environmental compliance, a place that typically dealt with grant validations and interagency audits, not property disputes. The subject line was understated: inquiry response, file 4423A. The message inside included a brief note apologizing for the delay and a link to a public server where she could download documents related to the Riverbend Greenbelt Initiative's state funding and environmental compliance review. Nothing about it felt intentional. It was as if the system had finally coughed up a file that had slipped through its teeth, unfiltered and unsanitized. Marina downloaded the zip folder, uncompressed it, and spent the next 5 hours poring over hundreds of pages, most of them technical, many of them redundant. But within them were two buried forms that immediately caught her attention. The first was a compliance declaration signed 6 months prior by a familiar name, D. Hayden, certifying that all properties acquired or transitioned under the initiative had been secured with full consent of the owners, and that all such transitions were documented and recorded. The second was a land use permit submitted on behalf of the cooperative, stamped with a date 2 weeks before her return to the country. The attached map included her parcel and a block labeled Phase 1, confirmed assets. This wasn't simply an administrative oversight. It was evidence of knowing misrepresentation. They hadn't just assumed she wouldn't come back, they'd already declared her property theirs in a funding application. That meant state money was tied to the lie. That changed everything. She forwarded the files to Torres, who responded within minutes with a short sentence, "We need to escalate this as fraud on a funding level." Within 24 hours, a revised motion was filed, attaching the new documents as supporting evidence for injunctive relief and potential criminal inquiry. What had begun as a property dispute had now stepped into the realm of misappropriation of public funds, false certification, and administrative fraud. Torres also sent a secondary notice to the state office that had provided the grant, flagging the documents for review and formally questioning the legality of the project's implementation. If they ignored the complaint, it would later implicate them. If they acted, it would fracture the cooperative's legal shield. Either way, the field had shifted. The tension outside Marina's window mirrored the transformation inside the case. The developers, once confident in their constructed legitimacy, began to recoil, tightening communication, pulling public materials offline, and pausing work at the site. The gravel path near the river was blocked with temporary fencing. New signs appeared, not promotional ones, but cold, bureaucratic placards reading "access restricted, administrative review pending." It was a retreat disguised as process. Marina recognized it instantly. But the real change came during a scheduled review hearing at the county courthouse, meant to determine whether the development work would be paused pending a full investigation. Hayden appeared in person, flanked by a lawyer who introduced himself in a clipped New York accent and radiated the kind of expensive energy reserved for people who normally worked in federal buildings, not sleepy county courthouses. Marina sat silently beside Torres as the lawyer attempted to reframe the entire initiative as a voluntary community project with widespread support and full legal compliance. He spoke of ecological stewardship, shoreline preservation, and the moral imperative of sustainability. His words were carefully chosen to evoke virtue, not law. When it came time for rebuttal, Torres stood calmly and handed the clerk a printed exhibit, the compliance declaration and the land use permit with the forged assumptions. She didn't speak in outrage. She simply pointed to the dates, the signatories, the obligations tied to state funds, and the contradiction of reality on the ground. The judge, a seasoned woman with a sharp eye for obfuscation, didn't react. She just nodded once, made a note, and said, "I'll review the documents and issue a ruling within 72 hours. They exited the courthouse in silence, but Marina could feel the tension shift like a current changing beneath her feet. The case had reached its midpoint, no longer a battle over property lines or municipal courtesy, but now a confrontation over institutional legitimacy. The cooperative couldn't afford scrutiny at the state level. Too much of their operation relied on the illusion of compliance. And now that illusion had cracked. 2 nights later, as Marina returned home from a quiet dinner in town, she noticed the temporary fencing near her former property had been removed. Not by workers, it had been cut and pulled aside, sloppily, as if someone had done it in a rush or in defiance. At the base of the cut fence, she found an empty manila folder, partially crumpled, with no labels or markings. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a site logistics schematic with handwritten annotations. The layout included not only her lot, but neighboring parcels, labeled with internal codes and what looked like pricing notes. At the bottom corner, someone had scrawled a 3-letter acronym, LV. She didn't know what it meant, but the tone of it felt internal, casual, like something never meant to be read by an outsider. She showed the document to Torres the next day, and together they agreed not to hand it over immediately. They needed to verify its authenticity first, and if it was real, it could be the missing link, a document that exposed premeditation beyond her parcel. This wasn't just a land grab. It was a territory shift, a calculated reallocation under the pretense of restoration, where each parcel was simply another domino in a larger development plan. Marina didn't know who had left the folder. Perhaps it was carelessness, perhaps a warning, or perhaps someone on the inside had grown nervous. The days that followed were quiet, which made her more uneasy than open hostility would have. No more calls, no more visits, no complaints filed. The site remained untouched. She increased the frequency of her check-ins, walking the perimeter in the late afternoon, scanning for movement, changes, unfamiliar footprints. Once she noticed a small metal stake driven into the ground near the southern edge of the parcel. It was marked with orange tape and a code LV03. She photographed it and added it to her records. The name ELV surfaced again when Torres's legal researcher discovered a development filing in a neighboring county, a proposal submitted by an entity called Evergreen Land Ventures. The applicant listed several individuals who had also appeared on the cooperative's board of advisors. The pattern was becoming undeniable. The cooperative was not the lead actor, it was a tool, a soft-faced intermediary shielding a more aggressive, profit-driven organization operating in parallel, rebranding itself with eco-conscious language while setting up for long-term infrastructure projects. The Greenbelt was not a preservation initiative. It was a conversion one step in a quiet campaign to secure land under the radar, using policy as a crowbar. With this knowledge, the stakes deepened. Marina's fight wasn't about recovering a structure or even protecting her own property. It was about exposing the mechanism, showing how language could be weaponized, how systems could be bent with a smile and a PDF, and how entire projects could move forward on the backs of falsified goodwill. And as she pieced it together, she felt the subtle weight of purpose settle over her, not like vengeance, but like clarity. The people who had dismantled her home hadn't just underestimated her resolve. They had built their structure on sand, assuming no one would notice as long as the story sounded virtuous. But virtue without truth was a fragile scaffold. And now, with the foundation cracking, Marina was the one watching from above. It began not with a confrontation, but with a silence so deliberate it was impossible to ignore. Following the court hearing and the submission of the fraudulent compliance documents, the cooperative didn't retaliate, they vanished. Their social media channels went dark. The office Marina had once visited was now listed as temporarily closed for internal restructuring. Even Hayden, once visibly present at public forums and local interviews, seemed to dissolve into the periphery. No statements were issued. No new promotional materials appeared. The only sign that the operation was still alive came from the courthouse docket, where opposing counsel quietly filed for an extension to prepare their response, citing unexpected documentation review delays. Marina understood the tactic. In war, sometimes the most dangerous period was when the enemy went quiet, not because they had surrendered, but because they were recalibrating, watching to see how far she would push before they were forced to act again. She did not wait for them to reemerge. Instead, she pushed forward. Torres assembled a team of 3 additional legal professionals, each with specialties in property law, nonprofit compliance, and environmental regulation. The case had grown too large, too intricate for a single-thread strategy. They needed to widen the aperture. Marina took no satisfaction in the escalation. She viewed it not as ambition, but necessity. The cooperative had wrapped itself in layers of technical insulation, each designed to shield them from individual culpability. Only a team could peel back those layers in time. And the time was narrowing. The surveyor Ortiz returned with an update on the lot's condition. 2 new soil borings had been conducted on her property without any recorded permit. Someone was still operating on the land, likely at night or during windowed hours when it appeared deserted. The soil samples had been discreet, but they left behind signs: small plugged cores, faint tire tracks near the utility access point, a chain dragged through soft earth. Marina took samples of her own from those disturbed areas and had them tested through a private lab. The results confirmed an unusual compound distribution consistent with site pre-treatment, not the kind used for environmental reclamation, but the kind applied to prepare soil for paving or heavy foundation placement. There was no ambiguity now. Someone was still building, just not openly. The firm's legal motion shifted again. now citing not just fraudulent acquisition, but unlawful entry, environmental manipulation, and trespass on a disputed parcel under judicial review. Torres filed an emergency motion for enforcement of the injunction, and this time the court responded with a firm notice. All development activities on parcel 481027 were to cease immediately pending final ruling. Violations would be subject to daily fines and potential criminal referral. The language was cold, decisive, and non-negotiable. Marina expected retaliation, but what came next was something different. That weekend, a drone appeared over her temporary rental home. It hovered silently for several minutes, then retreated. The footage it gathered, if any, would have shown nothing incriminating. Marina kept her movements quiet, her evidence secured off-site, her devices encrypted. But it was a signal. Someone wanted her to know she was being watched. The next day, 2 more anonymous complaints were filed with the zoning office, each claiming that she was operating a business without a permit. They were dismissed quickly, but they served their purpose, a reminder that her opposition had not given up, only shifted tactics. It was no longer about stopping her through institutions. Now it was about wearing her down through harassment, disorientation, and doubt. Marina met the escalation with professional precision. She moved her primary workspace to a legal co-working office downtown with badge access and internal security. She arranged daily digital backups to multiple off-site servers. She coordinated with Torres's firm to establish a firewall between herself and any media inquiries, insisting on total silence until the next hearing. No interviews, no statements, no quotes. The goal was not publicity, it was pressure, applied where the cooperative had the most to lose: legitimacy. Her presence was no longer reactionary. It was calculated, and the cooperative, once bloated with confidence, began to flinch. Their next mistake came in the form of a misfiled document in a separate but adjacent property case, one that Marina was monitoring due to its proximity to the original shoreline overlay. A land use form submitted for review included a topographic assessment that featured not just their parcel, but hers, still labeled with the internal tag LV03. Despite the active injunction and legal challenge, the cooperative's engineers had continued to submit integrated reports treating her land as part of the larger project. It was either arrogance or inertia, either way. It was damning. Torres compiled the evidence and presented it in court as a violation of the court order. The judge, already strained by the pattern of delays, responded with a formal reprimand and a summons for the cooperative's counsel to appear and explain the breach. Silence would no longer protect them. The process was now public record. In the midst of this legal tightening, Marina discovered another quiet revelation. While reviewing an older data set from the cooperative's archived site plans, she noticed a peculiar reference code embedded in one of the engineering files, a 3-digit reference that matched the metadata from a file she had pulled weeks ago off the abandoned folder left near the cut fencing. The code didn't appear to refer to any public document. She contacted a retired systems analyst she had worked with during a previous infrastructure project and asked him to decode the structure. He returned 2 days later with an answer. The code matched a proprietary file tagging system used internally by a private contracting group specializing in environmental utility pre-clearance. In plain terms, the cooperative had outsourced site development assessments to a company known for its low visibility prep work in advance of larger commercial infrastructure projects, parking lots, luxury water access, elevated platforms. They didn't just prepare the site, they erased obstacles. That group, listed under a generic alias in public contracts, was tied through a tangled ownership chain to Evergreen Land Ventures. LV. Everything came full circle. This wasn't a cooperative. It was a front of scaffolding to lend credibility to what was, at its core, a calculated, monetized seizure of river-adjacent land. Greenwashing, yes, but with surgical precision. With this information, Torres expanded the legal framework again. They now had grounds not only for civil action but for criminal inquiry, fraudulent permit issuance, misrepresentation in state grant filings, and willful violation of court orders. The motion was heavy, complex, and politically radioactive. And for the first time, Marina saw the cooperative flinch publicly. Their counsel filed a motion to enter mediation, not settlement mediation. A pause in hostilities, an attempt to regain control through back-channel negotiation. But Torres refused. Mediation requires a good faith foundation, she told Marina. They've burned that bridge. We don't pause now. We apply pressure until something breaks. Still, Marina knew the pressure wasn't one way. That night, someone left a message on her front door, no note, just a photograph printed in black and white, showing the lot from an aerial angle taken before demolition. It had been marked up with red lines, boundaries drawn, notes scribbled. It wasn't threatening, not overtly, but it was specific. Someone wanted her to know how early the plan had been finalized, how complete the acquisition had been in their minds. It was a message of inevitability. A whisper, "You're too late." She burned the photo. Not out of fear, but out of dismissal. She had no interest in warnings from people too cowardly to sign their names. If they had finished planning before she returned, then they had miscalculated from the beginning. Because what they had failed to predict, what they could never fully quantify, was her refusal to disengage. Marina was not fighting for an abstract principle or a symbolic win. She was dismantling a machine that had mistaken silence for consent and wrapped theft in regulation. And the more they tried to push her out, the deeper she embedded. By the end of the month, the court issued a second ruling. All cooperative and affiliated contractor activity on her parcel was to cease indefinitely. Any future access would require explicit judicial approval. The ruling was accompanied by a freeze on development funds tied to contested parcels. For the first time, money stopped moving. And with that, the machine paused. But Marina knew it wouldn't end there. The second escalation was always the most dangerous, not because it was loud, but because it was the point at which ambition turned into desperation. She didn't celebrate the ruling. She didn't relax. She did what she had always done. She documented everything, waited and prepared for the next move, because she knew it was coming. And when it did, she would already be standing at the fault line. It was early spring when the culmination began, not as a single explosive event, but as a convergence of pressure points, each one snapping into alignment like steel cables pulled taut. Marina had long anticipated that there would be a final push, one last coordinated attempt by the opposition to regain control of a narrative that had quietly slipped from their hands. The signs had been gathering for days, sudden reactivations of dormant email addresses linked to the cooperative, an increase in low-level legal noise motions filed without substance, clerical challenges to old evidence, bizarre demands for mediation schedules no one intended to honor. It was the behavior of a structure under stress, not collapsing yet, but vibrating under its own weight. Then, just as Torres's team was preparing a full discovery submission that would officially name Evergreen Land Ventures and its affiliated shell companies in the lawsuit, the cooperative made their move. It began with a letter, this time official, delivered by courier to Marina's legal address. It was thick, printed on paper, embossed with a new insignia, Riverbend Foundation Initiative. The cooperative had rebranded again. The contents of the letter were audacious. A formal accusation that Marina had willfully obstructed a community-backed environmental restoration project through litigation grounded in personal bias and misinformation, and a notice of countersuit seeking damages for delay-related losses. The demand was significant, accompanied by a vague accounting of economic harm, a list of missed grant milestones, and a fabricated estimate of community revenue loss. It was not a legal maneuver designed to win. It was designed to intimidate, calculated not for court, but for public consumption, as though the cooperative now understood they had to create an alternate narrative fast, but before discovery tore their infrastructure apart in front of a judge. Torres, unimpressed, prepared an immediate response. But Marina saw an opportunity. She didn't engage publicly. She didn't respond to the media contacts who now, after months of her silence, began reaching out with questions. Instead, she allowed the opposition's noise to echo unchecked. And just as she suspected, the contradictions began to pile up. In the newly created foundation's mission statement, they claimed their project had received full public support and listed several local community leaders as partners. Marina recognized two of the names and contacted them directly. Both individuals denied any affiliation. One was shocked to see his name printed online. Within days, legal notices of disavowal were filed by three supposed community supporters. The foundation's public credibility began to fray at the edges. Then came the hearing that no one on the other side wanted to happen, the court-mandated review of discovery compliance. Marina and Torres entered the courthouse with 12 boxes of meticulously indexed material, records of unauthorized soil sampling, inconsistencies in development permits, metadata pulled from falsified engineering files, and financial statements revealing cross-ownership between the cooperative's advisory board and Evergreen Land Ventures. The cooperative's legal team arrived with 2 briefcases and a folder that looked thin even from across the courtroom. They had assumed the case would be settled through attrition, not litigation. They were wrong. The judge presiding over the hearing, now fully aware of the case's evolution, had no patience for vagueness. Within the first hour, she ordered a full forensic audit of the cooperative's grant usage and placed a protective hold on their remaining public funds. Their attorney attempted to delay the ruling, claiming the documents were too complex for immediate review, but Torres countered with a chronological timeline so detailed and coherent that the judge issued a rare mid-session statement. There appears to be a willful pattern of deceit under the guise of nonprofit administration. I am deeply concerned. The real fracture came 2 days later when a whistleblower emerged not from within the cooperative, but from one of their subcontracted engineering firms. An anonymous affidavit, sent through legal channels and verified for authenticity, it revealed that her parcel had been marked as a priority transfer site 6 months before any official environmental review. The demolition had been pre-scheduled, the soil work pre-funded, and the land use tags coded not for restoration, but for commercial pier zoning. The report included internal memos, date-stamped and signed, showing that the removal of her property was step 1 in a larger plan to develop the entire riverfront for private access luxury retreats. Marina had never seen these memos. Neither had Torres. But the state auditor's office did, and within 48 hours they opened an investigation. Now, the house of cards truly began to fall. Within a week, the Riverbend Foundation initiative ceased all operations. Its website went offline. The cooperative's tax filings were flagged for irregularities. 2 board members resigned publicly. Marina received an email from a local reporter she had never spoken to before. It contained a single line, "I think they just figured out who they were dealing with." She didn't reply. The courtroom ruling came quietly, without press or grandstanding. The judge issued a partial decision in Marina's favor, declaring the demolition unlawful, the reclassification invalid, and the grant documentation materially misleading. A second hearing was scheduled to determine restitution and further penalties, including whether criminal referrals would be made. Torres considered the result a win. Marina didn't celebrate. She didn't need to. What had been taken from her couldn't be restored by court order, and she had never been fighting for sentiment. She had been fighting for truth. In the days that followed, offers arrived quietly from real estate agents representing unnamed buyers, all suggesting Marina consider selling the parcel while its value is at peak. She ignored them. The parcel wasn't for sale. It never had been. She filed for a reconstruction permit, one that allowed her to build not what had been destroyed, but something new. A structure that would stand on principle, not nostalgia. A physical reminder that what had been stolen was returned, not because she had fought the hardest, but because she had refused to let go. On the first day of spring, Marina walked the lot as the sun came up over the water. The river had settled, the ground was dry, and there was a stillness in the air that reminded her not of peace, but of readiness. The project would take time. The scars would remain, some visible, some not. But the land was hers again, legally, irrevocably. And the next time someone decided to take what wasn't theirs, they would remember what happened when they underestimated the one person who didn't walk away. They had thought she was gone. They had thought she wouldn't return. They had thought she was just another line on a map. They were wrong. By midsummer, the legal process had concluded with a clarity that was rare in disputes of this nature. The final ruling confirmed what Marina and her legal team had fought so long to prove. Her property had been unlawfully seized, the structures demolished without authorization, and the reclassification orchestrated through a network of misrepresented procedures, false certifications, and abuse of institutional trust. The court ordered full restitution not only for the property loss, but for legal costs, environmental tampering, and punitive damages tied to the misuse of state grant funds. The Riverbend Cooperative, now defunct and stripped of all legitimacy, was placed under investigation by both state and federal auditors. Evergreen Land Ventures dissolved its regional presence and ceased operations within 2 months of the ruling, a decision clearly meant to preempt further inquiry, though several of its executives were already under financial scrutiny. No appeals were filed. No public statements issued. What had once been a carefully layered operation had collapsed under the weight of its own design, exposed not by a massive whistleblowing campaign or media scandal, but by the unrelenting pressure of a single, methodical refusal to concede. Marina received the restitution in full, transferred by court order into a trust under her name, structured to fund not only the reconstruction of her property, but to ensure ongoing legal protections for the land. There were no celebratory interviews, no television coverage. She had declined all such requests. There was nothing to promote, nothing to dramatize. She had not fought to become a symbol. She had fought to reclaim what was hers and to expose those who had thought they could hide theft beneath the folds of legality. The story didn't need amplification. The outcome was its own conclusion. With the funds, Marina began rebuilding. Not a replica of the old structure. Nostalgia had no place in her approach, but something new, resilient, and precise. The new house was elevated and clean in design, blending environmental efficiency with structural strength. A modest dock was restored along the bank, this time with modern reinforcement, and the southern slope was replanted with native vegetation that could resist erosion without artificial barriers. She hired a local contractor team, vetted each person, and remained present throughout the process. There would be no abstraction, no delegation of oversight. The work happened in the open, in daylight, with permits clearly posted and documentation visible to any passerby. It was not just construction, it was a quiet statement of permanence. The community around the river began to shift as well, though subtly. Word of the case had spread in professional circles. Property owners, near disputed zones, began reviewing their documents more carefully. 2 other small parcels, previously labeled as voluntarily transitioned, were reinstated to their original owners after legal inquiries, though no public link to Marina's case was acknowledged. The illusion that these seizures were mere environmental policy had been pierced, and with it, the credibility of the actors who had used that narrative to disguise their ambitions. Torres and her team disbanded from the case on amicable terms once the final papers were signed. Marina sent each of them a handwritten note and a quiet thank you. She did not keep in touch beyond that. There was no need. The job was done. Her file cabinets were cleared of legal printouts, and her hard drives were wiped of court drafts and litigation correspondence. Only the necessary documents remained: ownership papers, permits, and the ruling. Everything else belonged to the past. On the 1-year anniversary of her return, Marina stood once more at the edge of the rebuilt dock. The river moved the same as it always had, unaffected by the drama it had silently witnessed. There were no signs left of what had been stolen. No caution tape, no broken posts, no symbolic remnants to be mourned. That, she realized, was the most important part of winning, not just regaining control, but erasing the damage completely meant removing every fingerprint of intrusion until what remained was defined only by her terms. Closure was not a ceremony. It was the absence of further interference. She had the option now to sell. The property's value had risen significantly after the publicity surrounding the court decision, even though the coverage had been quiet. Developers had changed their tone, offering not pressure but admiration, cloaked in polished language, a valuable partner. A legacy of resilience, an example of civic accountability. Marina rejected every offer, not out of spite, but because she no longer measured the land by what it was worth to others. It had returned to what it had always been hers, and no valuation could encompass that. She made one final change to the property, a discreet plaque, embedded in stone near the foot of the dock, engraved with no name, no date, only a phrase calm, unassuming, and final. This land does not forget who it belongs to. There were no more threats, no more late-night visits, no more drones or anonymous letters. The story had closed in full. The people who had once believed she would vanish had vanished themselves. The system, slow and imperfect as it was, had corrected. The structure she built now stood not as a defense, but as a presence quiet, immovable, and uninterested in compromise. In the end, there were no questions left to answer. No pieces left unresolved. Marina Kowalski had returned, reclaimed, rebuilt, and moved forward not as a victim or a symbol, but as a person who had simply refused to be erased. And now, with the sun sliding quietly across the water and the trees bending gently in the wind, the river knew her name again. Nothing else needed to be said.